In shoulder training and rehabilitation, there's a muscle that almost always goes unnoticed, the posterior deltoid. On paper, it seems we already work it with many back exercises, but in practice, something very different happens. Many patients and athletes think they're training it when they're actually compensating with other structures, especially other parts of the deltoid and an overly dominant upper trapezius. The result is a very common pattern. Anterior and middle shoulder dominance appears, along with cervical overload, less stability in the glenohumeral joint, and poorer performance in pulling exercises. That's why it's so important to know which exercises actually activate the posterior deltoid. This is where electromyography, or EMG, is especially useful, as it allows us to measure the muscle's electrical activity when it contracts and compare how much activation each exercise produces. This lets us know which muscle is activated, how much it's activated, and how it compares to other exercises. A higher EMG value doesn't automatically mean more hypertrophy, but it does indicate the muscle is receiving a high neuromuscular stimulus, which is essential for generating muscle tension and promoting strength development. In this analysis, we find 6 exercises ordered according to the activation of the posterior deltoid. In first place is the seated rear lateral raise, with approximately 82% activation relative to maximum voluntary contraction. It's probably one of the most specific exercises for this muscle if performed correctly. Torso leaned forward, stable scapulae, and controlled movement without momentum. The most frequent mistakes are shrugging the shoulders, activating the upper trapezius, using too much weight, or turning the movement into a jerk. In second place, we find the 45-degree bent over row with around 80% activation. To achieve this posterior deltoid involvement, it's important to keep the torso leaned and direct the movement by pulling the elbows back without shrugging the shoulders. When the movement vector is directed towards the upper abdomen or lower chest area, the posterior deltoid participates much more. The third exercise is the battle ropes with nearly 60% activation. Although not usually considered a specific hypertrophy exercise, it generates considerable activation due to constant scapular stabilization and repeated work of the posterior shoulder area. It can be very useful in metabolic training, general physical preparation, or final phases of rehabilitation. In fourth place is the diagonal cable raise, with approximately 52% activation. This exercise introduces a more functional diagonal pattern, improves scapulohumeral coordination, and activates the posterior deltoid along with the external rotators, while allowing constant tension thanks to the cable. In fifth place, we find dumbbell lateral raises with nearly 47% activation. Although they're mainly seen as a middle deltoid exercise, they can also engage the posterior deltoid if done with a slight forward lean of the torso and by pulling the elbows slightly back in the scapular plane. Finally, the upright barbell row shows around 42% activation of the posterior deltoid. This exercise mainly activates the middle deltoid and the upper trapezius, but depending on the technique, it can also involve the posterior part of the shoulder, especially if a wider grip is used and the elbows are raised outwards. Beyond the list of exercises, the key idea is something else. Choosing the right exercises makes a big difference in muscle development and injury prevention, but it's even more important to know which muscle is actually working. Many patients feel they're activating a muscle when in reality they're compensating with other more dominant ones. Electromyography allows us to check this objectively, detect muscle compensations, adjust technique in real time, and validate if the stimulus the muscle receives is enough to generate an adaptation. So instead of assuming an exercise works, you can measure if it's actually working. The posterior deltoid is a key muscle for shoulder health and performance, but it's often undertrained. That's why in training and rehabilitation, it's not the one who does more exercises who wins, but the one who manages to activate the right muscle with the right stimulus. Remember, in the links in the video description below, you can get information and discover how to integrate EMG into your practice to identify compensations, optimize shoulder exercises, and design much more precise strengthening programs.